and go. Hi, in this short lecture, I just want to talk about a few themes related to early Christianity. In particular, the rise of Christianity and what I call the historian's questions. I hope by now you've had a chance to look at the video link that I posted last week from the documentary film on PBS called From Jesus to Christ. What I want to do today is just talk a little bit about a few themes, and then you can blend this with what you gleaned from the documentary, and also from the material in the textbook. So first of all, Christianity is a religion, and it's there are people of great religious faith. I want to make it clear what the historical study of Christianity as part of Western civilization entails. So we want to see what is the historian's role. The historian's role is not to judge whether Jesus, was the Son of God, or whether there is a God. As an historian, there are specific historical questions related to early Christianity and to Jesus. So if you look at the PowerPoint that accompanies this, you can follow along. The first topic is the quest for the historical Jesus. Beginning in the early 19th century, primarily among German scholars, there began a search for trying to uncover what scholars could learn about the historical figure of Jesus. This is different than the question about religious faith and what Jesus' message is. It comes at a time, after the Enlightenment, when there is lots of scholarship, focusing on history. It comes at a time when there's lots of archaeological exploration in the ancient world, primarily from, German and French and English, archaeologists. And religious scholars began to take on a whole new set of questions. So by the mid 19th century, we see this quest for the historical Jesus coming to become an important part of New Testament studies. Again, that's different than the question of, what's the religious takeaway? As an historical endeavor, it means what can we learn about the world of Jesus, and what can we learn about Jesus himself. If you've seen the documentary that I posted last week, you'll get a sense of where some of these endeavors have led. By the late 20th century, early 21st century, we now have lots of scholarship that helps us recreate the world in Jerusalem. So that's one thing I want to make clear. That is an historical topic, the quest for the historical Jesus. Another question is the problem of sources. I'll talk about that momentarily. What do we really know about Jesus? What do we know about early Christianity and how it formed? If you're a Christian and you are used to what you've been told in religious education classes, you might be surprised to learn that there's much more scholarly nuance than what is usually stated. There are some problems of sources, but this gives rise to a whole new kind of scholarly interpretation, and we'll talk about that momentarily. The third topic is of interest for historians is the spread of Christianity in the early centuries. How do we explain a phenomenon like Christianity, which grew from just maybe 100 followers at the time of Jesus' death to millions in the Roman Empire at the time of Constantine, and then it becomes this major cultural force in the Roman Empire, which creates the cultural background for the medieval world. Another historical question: how do we see the formation of the canon and of theology? The canon refers to those official readings, the official texts that become part of the tradition. For example, the four Gospels and all the materials we see in the New Testament, well, that's all part of the Christian canon. But there are a lot of other materials that are left out of the canon that are not viewed as being official, not being viewed as being orthodox. There had to be a process over several centuries of sorting things out and saying these are the official texts that we're going to latch onto, and this is what we will teach, and there are other texts which we will exclude. The theological component follows from that. What about the theology here in terms of God's nature? What is Jesus' relationship to God? What is the nature of God in the Trinity? So these are all things that have to develop. It doesn't come fully formed into the world all at once. In fact, it takes 3 to 4 centuries to see this sorting out. We'll look at that momentarily. The other thing that historians tend to look at is the formation of the church as an institution. It's a very large institution that has a great deal of cultural as well as religious influence in late antiquity and also in the medieval world. What is its political structure? What is its hierarchy? How does it relate to social issues and to political topics? That's a separate topic. We won't get into that too much, but the textbook talks a good deal about the formation of the church as an institution. Of course, the role of the popes, the papacy, is a whole interesting topic just by itself. We can also, as historians, look at the transition that we call late antiquity, which I referred to in a different lecture. The empire is in transition. This is the Roman Empire I'm talking about here. How does Christianity play into this transition? The Roman Empire, as it moves out of its empire status into devolving, leaves a legacy of a Christian culture in Europe. So the church really becomes the conduit for much of the culture that the ancient Roman Empire had. So we can look at the role of Christianity in terms of the late Roman Empire, and also as Christianity was spread in northern European places. And finally, we can look at this at the transition towards a Christian Europe. To understand Europe in the Middle Ages, you need to understand that it's a Christian Europe. There are Muslims in the Mediterranean world, in Spain. There are Jews who are scattered throughout Europe. But as an official culture, as the doctrine that's embraced by the political leadership, it's a Christian world. You really can't understand European thought and culture, or even Renaissance art or the Reformation, without understanding the idea of a Christian Europe. This is how Europeans conceived of themselves, even as they lived alongside Jews and Muslims. So those are some of the themes that the historians look at when we look at early Christianity. These are historical questions. I'm just going to talk about a few of these. The first has to do with sources. The sources that we have from around the year 30, Common Era, to around the year 130, we have almost none. And this comes as a surprise to some students who may have been raised thinking that the Gospels were written by contemporaries of Jesus, people who walked with him, so to speak. That's not true in terms of what contemporary scholarship has revealed. In truth, we know very little about the writers of the Gospels. We know that they're called John and Matthew and Luke, but we know very little about who they were. I'll talk more about that in a moment. The sources that we have that are not Christian sources, that don't come from the Gospels or the New Testament, raises an interesting question. We don't have very many. We do have some sources. We have some pagan sources, which means non-Christian sources. From Pliny the Younger and Tacitus, these were Roman writers, and the passages are very, very small. So we do have an established record here of them referring to Jesus and what's going on in the Near East, but they don't give us very, very much. There's only one Jewish source at this time period in the first century, and that's from Josephus, Flavius Josephus. We'll call him Josephus for short. He had a particular perspective that he was trying to to make when he was recording this. But again, that's not a very lengthy passage. And then finally, we have, if we go to Christian sources, we have a lot more. We have the 4 canonical Gospels. We also have the later discovered non-canonical Gospel of Thomas, and we have lots and lots of Paul's writings. Much of the New Testament is filled with the writings of Paul, who became a convert to Christianity, who was almost a contemporary of Jesus, but who would not have known Jesus, would not have met Jesus. We owe to Paul a lot of the formation of early Christianity. So what about these 4 canonical Gospels? Well, we know this, that they were written perhaps 35 to 65 years after the death of Jesus. This means at least 1 generation, 2 generations after the death of Jesus. What happened in the interim period was that there were a series of oral traditions of people spreading the word of Jesus' teachings and of his death. There were some writings, and we know what a few of these were. Although we don't know who wrote them, we do know that there were sources that the gospel writers referred to. So these gospels written 35 to 65 years after the death of Jesus, was based on an oral tradition, which we talked about. We talked about Homer, the oral tradition, and another written source in particular that we don't know very much about. Don't want to leave you hanging there. Historians have discovered a lot of things since the middle of the 20th century that have been able to open the doors for our understanding about this. So a little bit about the Gospels. I won't talk too much about John, but the 3 Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, scholars refer to as the Synoptic Gospels, in the sense that they have similar stories. These are all related. So we can actually take one gospel, put it next to another one, and then to the third one, and actually begin an editorial investigation of what facts emerge. What are the similarities? What are the differences? And this is something that scholars began to do in the early 19th century. And this has proved to be very revealing. We learned that there were, some changes. We learned, for example, that there were errors in transcription made by some of the medieval monks. But it's important to keep in mind that all the 4 gospel writers were engaging in something that was a matter of faith. We don't know if they were Luke or John or Matthew. That we say it was in the book according to Matthew. It doesn't mean that Matthew actually sat down at a computer and typed it out. It was in the tradition of this person called Matthew. So we know very little about the biographical information. So when we say Matthew, Luke, and Mark, we're talking about these texts themselves, even though we don't know much about the authors of these texts. Here we have to be careful of what I call the genre problem. Genre, G-E-N-R-E, is a word that's used in literature to refer to different types of writing. Poetry is one genre. Playwriting, theater is a different genre. Novels is a different genre, fiction. We have different genres around us today. Journalism, the daily newspaper, is a genre. Sports writing is a separate genre. What you read online, constitutes multiple genres. We would not look to, let's say somebody's, autobiographical writing to necessarily reveal the truth about something. We look to journalism to help us understand what happened yesterday in Washington. But that kind of journalistic focus was not what the gospel writers were trying to do. History writing is a genre. The textbook that you're reading is a genre. The writers of the Gospels were not trying to do journalism. They were not trying to do history. That's why I call this the genre problem. If we understand them to be doing history or journalism, it leaves us kind of hanging. But if we understand that they were trying to preach a religious message, that's a much different phenomenon to explore. So we should not look at them as being reporters newspaper reporters recording what actually happened verbatim. We shouldn't look at them as being historians. We understand them to be early Christians who were trying to convey the good news as they saw it. So the folded in with this narrative that they construct are lots of other materials, because their job really is to convince people that Christianity offers a new message. So that's the genre problem. I mentioned Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I want to talk about Matthew and Luke in particular. Scholars have discovered that the two Gospels rely upon one particular source, and they call this unknown source Q. Q because it's from the German word Quelle, which means source. So the German scholars call this source Q. They know that there was borrowing from both the writers of Matthew and Luke from this source. So that much we know. There was a shared source that was made use of by both the writers of Matthew and Luke. And this leads me to my next point, which is the important scholarship that occurred in the 19th and 20th centuries, and the rise of what's called textual criticism. I mentioned earlier the archaeological work that was being done, but there was also a great focus on scholarship in ancient writings. The Germans in the 19th century, plowed through Plato and Aristotle and Homer and identified what was, important, and they enumerated these passages and they began analyzing these things. This was carried over to the studies of the New Testament. And textual criticism means analysis, evaluation, not criticism in the sense of making, critical points, arguing with things, but to analyze and to evaluate. And this is kind of what you do in a literature class, when you sit down to try to explore what the author of a particular novel was trying to talk about, So we owe this to the 19th century and early 20th century. So by the time we come into the mid-20th century, we have 150 years of excellent scholarship in textual criticism and analysis, going hand in hand with some archaeological work. And then I want to talk about what happens in the middle of the 20th century. Two very interesting phenomena, and both of them were mentioned in the documentary that I asked you to look at. The first is the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. These were texts that were discovered in the desert between 1947 and 1956, after World War II. What we learned from these texts, which took a while to become, identified and evaluated and then translated, and then of course multiple generations of scholars have evaluated and analyzed this up to now. We've learned to understand the religious worldview, the cultural worldview of people in the Near East. And this was the culture, this was the world that gave rise to Jesus and his followers. So this has helped fill in a lot of information that scholars, historians did not have until the middle of the 20th century. Also, after World War II, there was a very interesting discovery in Egypt at a place called Nag Hammadi. This reveals the Gnostic library. Gnostics were people who offered a much different interpretation of Jesus. This library was discovered in 1945 by Muhammad Ali, who dug up these pots and brought them home, and unfortunately his mother used some of these to burn in the fireplace. But fortunately, we have most of them. And they were translated eventually after the issue of ownership was, handled, and, who could have these documents. And it ended up being compiled into a very large book. We have here lots and lots of source material that earlier Christians, earlier religious studies people, earlier historians did not have. The Nag Hammadi Library, as it's called, gives us a further window into understanding early Christianity in the world in which the followers of Jesus operated within. And what we learn from the Dead Sea Scrolls and from the Nag Hammadi documents is that there really isn't one Christianity. It's easy for us today to read backwards in time and say, well, there was just one Christianity. Jesus lived, Jesus died, his followers came forward with his message, the Gospels were written, and we have it all encompassed in the New Testament. That's not the way it happened. In fact, for the first 4 centuries after the death of Jesus, we actually have multiple Christianities. And that's the way what you sort of think about this. One Christianity emerges only after a period of 3 to 4 centuries of discussion, debate, into sorting out what was the true essence of Christianity, into what we call now an orthodox position, the correct belief to have. Orthodox positions arise only when certain positions are viewed as being official and sanctioned by the church, and other positions are viewed as being incorrect. It took 3 to 4 centuries for an orthodoxy to form. So this is very interesting. Historians have looked at this process, and we learned, for example, that there were rival orthodoxies. It wasn't just, Catholicism or Christianity, to use the pre-Reformation word that we can talk about. There were multiple forms of Christianity, and they keep popping up, even in the Middle Ages. There are heresies that are pushed down by the church. Heretical beliefs are those beliefs that don't follow official doctrine. And we'll talk more about that as we move into the late Middle Ages. So there are rival orthodoxies. Gnostic Christianity was just one type of Christianity which in its time had lots of followers. It did not look at the resurrection of Jesus as being a literal event. It looked at the message of Jesus as arguing for self-knowledge and self-transformation. Gnosis is one Greek word that refers to knowledge. This is the message of self-knowledge that Jesus was preaching. This is according to the Gnostic writers that were discovered in the Nag Hammadi library. Of course, we know now that's not the message of Christianity. The Orthodox position eventually became the resurrection was literal, and therefore the resurrection of all Christians is a possibility. But it took several centuries for this process to sort itself out. So it's a very nuanced look at how the tradition evolved. Another variation of early Christianity, which the textbook talks about, is Arianism. The Arians, who were, it was viewed as a heresy by the official church leaders, viewed that the Son, Jesus, was divine, but not the equal of God the Father. The Council of Nicaea in the year 325 gives the formulation that we call the Nicene Creed now, which many Christians recite, and certainly in the Catholic tradition is recited, and trying to bring into line the official teachings. These are the official positions that you as a Christian have to hold. The disputes continued, though, for nearly 300 years. The final resolution for this was the doctrine of the Trinity, that God consists of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But this did not happen all at once. It took centuries for this to sort itself out. Other things to mention here, as an historian, include the spread of Christianity. How do we explain that maybe there were 100 Christians at the time of the crucifixion, and thousands of Christians by the year 70? The Gospels are just starting to be written at this point. The Gnostics are working their writings at this particular point. And then we fast forward to the Roman Empire around the year 300, just before Constantine. There may have been 60 million people in the Roman Empire, the entire Mediterranean world, going everywhere from Egypt and Jerusalem on up to Britain. But maybe 5 million Christians is out of that population. That's a large number. How do you explain that kind of large increase? Well, the film I had you look at talks a little bit about what the attraction to Romans might have been for Christianity. And there's good reasons why people might leave the pagan traditions and become part of the Roman, part of the Christian tradition. It's different for Jewish people. The Jews actually, in the beginning, were the ones that Jesus was preaching to. But there develops a split, and this happens at the time of Paul and right after Paul. The issue was originally whether one had to be Jewish first and then convert to Christianity. The message is eventually developed that no, one could be a pagan and then immediately become a Christian. So there's a division between Jews and Christians. The two religions will begin to diverge. But how is it that people in the Roman Empire who were not Jews, people in the Roman Empire who would have been pagan, how did they get attracted to this? The historian Rodney Stark, he's an historian, but his background is actually in sociology, and he loves to crunch numbers and do all kinds of data analysis. Rodney Stark, after an investigation, he's written several books on early Christianity, concluded that a 40% increase of Christians in each decade would be sufficient to get the numbers from a few thousand up to 5 million by the year 300. So, it's mathematically possible, but what is it about the message that appealed to different people? Well, we know the message appealed to the middle class. The message, not so much to the poor, but more to the middle class. It offered a happier, more secure way of life. I would refer you to one of the segments in the documentary that I had you read. But by the time we get to the Emperor Constantine, we see Christianity becoming adopted as the official religion of the Roman Empire. And that's why I said earlier that the demise of the Roman Empire is one thing, but the continuity that the Roman Empire gave to medieval Europe included this very important cultural development, and that is Christianity. And that is how Charlemagne, and that is how the people in the Middle Ages who built the giant Gothic cathedrals, who engaged in the Crusades, would have viewed themselves. It's also what occupied the thoughts of Martin Luther, so important for the Reformation, and also what occupied so many painters and writers during the Renaissance. So thank you very much. I hope this clarified a few things for you. Thank you very much.